Hello, welcome to this, our 33rd talk on this YouTube series on time, the physics of time. It's been about 8 months since my last talk. I've been involved in a lot of our interesting projects, and we'll get to that later. Today I'm going to talk about speculating on the nature of time, in quotes here. This is going to be a little bit different than the previous talks. I'm not going to be using rigorous logic or empirical data. Instead, it's going to be kind of a blue sky talk, and maybe the idea is half-baked, but I'm hoping that this will be a catalyst for others, for you viewers, to comment and give feedback, and maybe it'll be full-baked when I have to add those comments in, or you may just debunk the whole idea. So this is not directly related to relativity or relativity's replacement like most of the other talks, and I may even recant on this speculation. But I thought it'd be fun and interesting to throw out a new view of time. Now, when I started this talk, this series, almost 2 years ago, in that first talk, I said, I had a couple of quotes here. I said that time, we're going to look at time not from a philosophical point of view, but from a pure physics point of view. And to do that, we need to build time on a rigorous construct. And that rigorous construct was proper time, which is a true physics construct with an operational definition, and it's observer independent. All the good qualities of the good physics construct. So 2 years later, I really hadn't been thinking about this philosopher's idea of time in quotes. I had just set it aside as being too vague and didn't seem like it was specific enough that one could build physics on it. But I've sort of taken another step since then, and I wasn't, all through that 2 years, I wasn't thinking about the philosopher's idea of time, but maybe my subconscious was, because I came to the conclusion that, hey, proper time is all you need. The philosopher's idea of time seemed superfluous, and the idea didn't seem to have any existence in reality, and further, it was kind of misleading as to what the reality of time was. And actually, without thinking about time, a pure physics view of time occurred to me spontaneously very recently. So let's look at proper time again. Proper time is operationally defined as the time accumulated on a clock between two events where the clock is present. So there's no ambiguity. It's crystal clear exactly what you mean by proper time, and proper time is used throughout all of physics. A clock is driven by a process. So when you think about it, the units of proper time are really units of a process. A clock is defined in terms, the face of the clock shows hours and seconds, and it has a second hand. But that's sort of a translation into a common language of time. But The clock is just representing the number of cycles or vibrations of a physical process. So proper time is very physical. It's absolute and observer independent. Very well defined construct. Now we're going to talk a little bit about philosopher's time. I was most of the way through my 32 first talks when I got a call from a philosopher who was writing about time. And a physicist who knew him told him, gee, you better give Nick a call if you want to understand the physics of time. So we had a series of communications, and he pointed me to all of his favorite philosophers and their key writings, and I read them, and they seemed just like a bunch of words to me. That didn't translate to physics, and in fact didn't really translate to reality. So I just sort of put that aside. But to try and give you an idea of philosopher time, it says time, like space, has its own existence beyond clock time. For some, I got the feeling that they're kind of thinking that there's some universal clock outside the universe, and 10 ticks on the universal clock is the real measure of time, and it may equate to 3 ticks on a physical clock on Earth and some other number of ticks on a physical clock on Jupiter or whatever. But I came to the conclusion that philosopher's time, and when I write time with a capital T in quotes, that's my shorthand for philosopher's time. Save a little space in doing the presentation. So philosopher's time, to me, is an academic abstraction of the concept of time. And as such, it's a bit dangerous if you have it influence your thinking on physics. So I came to think of philosophical time as really being psychological time. Philosophical time it seems to represent time that we move through, or that flows along past us, or that we are swept along by a flow of time. But I think that's a purely psychological model that we create as infants, and it's a very natural model when we look around and we see all these things that move and whatnot. That it's not space, it's movement, it's time. So we continue to experience that way, and our language is built on, I think, the philosopher's construct of time, and probably one sentence in 10 will talk about time, and not necessarily in the context of proper time. But I contend that time is not part of physical reality, philosopher's time. But because we've experienced it all our lives as being that way, it's going to be tough to adjust our thinking to a new perspective on what is time. Okay, let's just quickly look at space versus time. Space has a three-dimensional reality. For example, many physical objects exist simultaneously in different locations in three-dimensional space. So space seems to have a physical reality. Again, I contend that time is not a physical entity, and it has no dimensionality. Let me expand on that. I claim it's not like a river that sweeps us along or flows by us, and the past, present, future do not all exist simultaneously. The past no longer exists. At best, it's just a partial history of processes that exist. We have history books that tell a story about what happened, but many of them slanted this way or that have nothing to do with what actually happened. In the Grand Canyon, there's lots of sediments that give kind of a partial history of the epics of geology, but that partial history is open to interpretation and misinterpretation, and it certainly is not the whole thing, and it's not, you can't step into the past by looking at it. Similarly, the future does not yet exist, so there's no sense of things flowing by or us flowing into the future. Okay, the psychological construct of time, I contend, adds nothing to our understanding of physical reality, which is what these talks are focusing on. Further, the psychological construct of time, philosopher's time, is misleading and quite dangerous. The philosopher's time, I'm saying, should be replaced by looking at energy and processes. Rage should not be expressed in terms of time, but process rates, which are expressions of motion and cycles and vibrations, which in turn are byproducts of energy. So I'm thinking of physical time as not being an entity unto itself, but a byproduct of energy. When I say that it's a property of processes, it's sort of like color. Color doesn't really exist as a physical entity. Matter emits a vibration of a particular frequency that's interpreted by our brains as being a color. And I'm saying time is somewhat similar to that. It can be manifested by vibrations which we interpret as time. So it has a physical reality, but it's not an entity unto itself. It's sort of a byproduct, property of other physical entities. For example, 1 second, here's our unit of time, but what is it? It's really defined in terms of a specific process, a number of vibrations of a specific process. Now, as I mentioned before, not only is the construct of philosopher's time embedded in our brains and the way we think since infancy, but it's also totally embedded in our language, and I don't expect our language to change to be consistent with what I'm talking about here. For instance, we used to say, "Hey, honey, wait 1 second, I'll be with you." I don't expect people to say, "Hey, honey, just wait 9,192,631,770 cycles of the unperturbed ground state hyperfine transition frequency of cesium-133. For one thing, I think that takes about 30 seconds to say, and the other thing, it's kind of difficult to picture how long a delay it's going to be. Okay, let's expand on that about time expressed as processes. Actually, since ancient time, there's no way of expressing pure time. We always express things in terms of processes. Like the year, the month, the day, the hour are defined in terms, respectively, of the Earth's solar orbit, lunar orbit, the Earth's revolution around its axis, and for the hour, a fraction thereof. So, in a way, we've always thought of time as processes. It's just that we've abstracted it, and in our language, the term second, hour, day don't necessarily conjure up the process that gave rise to that particular word and that particular amount of quote-unquote time. Again, I contend time is not a separate entity. Physical time is a property of motion and physical processes. It's a byproduct of physical causes and physical effects. One example of that is physical energy causes physical emotion. Physical motion, that's an effect. And when we see something moving, that conjures up the idea of time passing. For example, we might think of how many miles per hour is that going? Well, the concept of miles is very well defined physically in concrete space. But per hour, that's defined in terms of a process. And we've come to get a feel for how long a second is, how long a minute is, how long an hour is. So that's why those words make sense to us. Now, think of an empty universe. Let's say if the universe was just inert blocks, and there are no atoms, they're just inert matter sitting, and there's no movement whatsoever. So you have space, you have physical things, but there's no gravitational force pulling them together, and there's no atomic motion in the blocks. They're just inert matter. Well, one could have space, but there'd be no sense of time passing at all. But if we filled that empty universe with energy, and the resulting motion and processes that would come with the injection of energy, then time is also added. So again, time is a byproduct of energy and the resulting motion and processes. Okay. Physical reality, 3D space is physical. Energy and forces cause physical objects to move, cycle, vibrate, so that all of that is physical, and I'm calling it durations rather than time. Process durations are expressed in terms of the properties of those processes, and that really is what time is. It's the number of cycles, or the number of vibrations, or the amount of motion that has occurred. Okay, that's the main idea. Let me add a couple of quick things. We have the arrow of time, Now, in my last discussion, which was just a quick link or preview of Kent Mayhew's new thermodynamics, the old arrow of time, represented by the second law of thermodynamics, namely that entropy is always increasing and disorder is always increasing. That no longer exists. Second law of thermodynamics was wrong. The construct of entropy had major problems. But for this new construct of time, the pure physical construct of time, the new arrow of time is a very natural one. The arrow of time is that physical causes cause physical effects. Causes come before effects. You don't have physical effects causing causes. And by the way, the very example that they used to use for the old arrow of time, of someone drops a coffee cup on a marble floor and it breaks into pieces, and they were saying if you ran that backwards, you could tell it was running backwards because a bunch of pieces don't automatically reassemble into a nice coffee cup with no leaks. And basically that's what the meaning of the arrow of time is. The physical causes come before the physical effects. Basically an aside. Why does trying to think about the physical reality of time matter? Well, I contend we need an accurate physical model. Otherwise, we're likely to go astray, even if we come up with the right numerical answers for certain physical effects. If we don't have an accurate physical model in mind, then that's certainly going to inhibit progress. And let me give an example. I think that special relativity's model of four-dimensional space-time, with space and time morphing into each other, that's an example where the concept of philosopher's time as a physical dimension was very misleading and made it easier to go down the wrong path. There is an example of an academic abstraction that has no basis in reality, facilitating going down the wrong path in physics. So that's my idea for the moment. As I say, I may even recant on it. I haven't been a contender of this view for very long, and I'm hoping that the people who view this talk will give me feedback to help me further construct it or to debunk it. So thank you very much for tuning in. Hope to see you next time when we'll have a similar topic about the very foundations of physics and time. Thank you.